Please, let's ignore the sag. Hello friends, my name is Ian and welcome back. The middle of your novel will probably be one of the hardest things you have to write. The second act, or confrontation, takes double what both the first and third act take up, which means the second act takes up 50% of your novel. Writers often like to call it the sagging middle because it can get very boring if not done right. Act 2 is very wide open, which is why a lot of writers find this to be very difficult. Making sure this is done right is paramount to making your book or novel successful. With that being said, let's get into it. Just like the last video on Act 1, in this video, we're going to start with what the second act tries to accomplish. The first thing it does is obviously bridge Act 1 to Act 3. You can't go from Act 1 directly to Act 3 because the plot just wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to get into a character and learn about them and build up the tension until the climax. It also escalates the conflict. Without an escalation in conflict, there might as well not even be a story to begin with. It challenges the protagonist with obstacles that they must overcome. Obstacles is part of what helps transform the character and get them closer to finally defeating the antagonist. It puts the protagonist through major character development. The world is explored and developed, and finally, it prepares your readers for the finale and climactic confrontation in Act 3. So one thing I forgot to mention in the previous two videos of this series is something called the truth and the lie. The lie is what the character starts the story believing, and that belief is wrong. The truth is usually the central theme of your story. It's what you want to share with people, and it's what the protagonist should really be believing. In Act 2, the protagonist is given the chance to either accept the truth or fall further into the lie, thus creating a positive or negative change arc. If the character starts to believe the truth, that is a positive change arc. If they fall back onto the lie, that is a negative change arc. And this is specifically for character arcs. The second act is just as much about the internal struggle for the character as it is for the external struggle of the character. This internal conflict makes your character more interesting and more believable and relatable. In the next part of the video where we go over each section, I would like to make a warning and say that 4 sections I am going to be talking about is not part of the traditional 3-act story structure, and I will explain why to you later. However, I did not come up with these. This is the part where I know I took heavy inspiration from K.M. Weiland with their way of how they outline, and I moved that into my workflow, which has worked wonders for me. These sections are both the action and the reaction part of your writing. These parts are then split into 2 on either side of the pinch points. But with that, let's actually get into talking about these sections. Let's start with the first reaction period. Reaction period A, before the first pinch point. This part of the story bridges from the end of Act 1 until the first pinch point. The character struggles to understand the conflict and the obstacles being thrown in their way by the antagonist, both mentally and physically. They try to chase their goal while avoiding getting themselves hurt or facing their lie. Since everything for the protagonist has been turned upside down, they have to find a new way to deal with the world around them. And the protagonist and other characters will be reacting very strongly to the first plot point, which ended Act 1. In the last video, we used Star Wars as an example. In this video, we're going to be doing the same thing, continuing on with what Star Wars had us going for. The first reaction period in Star Wars is when Luke, Obi-Wan, and the droids go to Mos Eisley on Tatooine to find a way off-planet to get to Alderaan. They find Han Solo and Chewbacca, who are willing to take them should they be able to pay. After an altercation in which an arm comes off of a criminal by lightsaber, Obi-Wan and Luke leave the cantina just in time before stormtroopers arrive, and they make their way to the hangar. Han has an encounter with Jabba the Hutt, who he owes money to. After this, Luke, Obi-Wan, and the others get ready to leave. Next up is the first pinch point. The first pinch point is about 37% of the way through, midway between the end of Act 1 and the midpoint. This serves as an event to help support the midpoint, because the midpoint cannot hold up the middle of the story on its own with it being so long. After all, there are many supports that hold up a house. Without all those supports, it would just come falling down. New clues about the conflict appear to the protagonist, and they are given a reminder of the antagonist's power. It centers your readers back on this center conflict. You want the protagonist to feel it. This can be a small setback or a small plot twist that changes the way the character sees what's happening. Remember that a clue is also important for this section. It is also a decent idea to show the antagonist at some point during the pinch point. After Luke and Obi-Wan get transport off the planet, they are chased off planet by stormtroopers and are under fire from the ground into space. They, of course, escape, or the story would have ended there. However, the real pinch point is happening on the Death Star above Alderaan. Grand Moff Tarkin and Darth Vader use the Death Star laser to completely destroy the planet, turning it into an asteroid field. They do this in front of Leia, who called Alderaan home. This is a true show of force of the Empire, and that if you mess with them, you will be annihilated. Obi-Wan feels the deaths, and this is a clue to the protagonist and other characters that something has gone wrong. Next, let's get to the second reaction period. Reaction period B, after the first pinch point. This connects the first pinch point to the midpoint. The protagonist starts to have more realizations about the conflict, both internally, the truth and the lie, and externally, the plot. The reactions they go with are more informed as they get more details about what the conflict is. The protagonists and other characters react to the first pinch point. They continue to get a clearer picture of what is at stake. Back to Star Wars, Luke is taught the basics of how to use the Force by Obi-Wan, and is also taught how to use a lightsaber with a training droid. Luke is starting to realize that the galaxy is a lot bigger than he thought it was, and that this could be about something much bigger than just himself. Han doesn't believe in the Force, so they show him that, and he still doesn't believe it. They soon come up on Alderaan, where they are expecting to see a planet, which, of course, we know now they won't see. Now we get to the midpoint, or the centerpiece for your novel. The midpoint, as its name suggests, takes place in the middle of the story at about 50% of the way through. This helps keep the reader's attention, just like the pinch points do, and of course helps prevent that boring or sagging middle. This is usually a very big plot twist where the truth is finally starting to dawn on the protagonist. Everything they thought they knew about the conflict was wrong, but now a new understanding is starting to break through. It is the moment of truth. It marks the shift from the pre-midpoint reaction period to the post-midpoint action period. The protagonist starts to actively chase their goal, which mirrors what the first half of the second act accomplished. The first half, the character was a lot more passive and reacted to things around them. Now they are acting and purposely chasing a goal. Back to the examples. Luke, Han, and the others arrive at the Alderaan system. When they come out of light speed, they come out into a debris field. While they wonder what happened, a TIE fighter comes and strafes them. Han chases them, and they start to approach what looks like a large moon. However, this is the Death Star. Before they can turn around and run, they're caught in the Death Star's tractor beam and pulled on board. It seems their goal to deliver the plans have gone to the wayside. They sneak off the Falcon dressed as stormtroopers and find their way to a control room. Here, Obi-Wan splits off to turn the tractor beam off, but it is found out that Princess Leia is on board and she is being ready to be executed. Luke transitions from reacting to acting by deciding to go and save Princess Leia. Now let's talk about the action period with action period A, which is before the second pinch point. This part separates the midpoint and the second pinch point. Because of the newfound understanding they gained from the midpoint, the protagonist starts to make advances against the antagonist, both mentally and physically. With their insight, the protagonist approaches the situation from a different angle, and it usually begins with a very strong action. The protagonist begins to proactively move against the antagonist and the lie, not allowing himself to fall back on that lie or to fall back and react to things again. The entire action period, including the part after the first pinch point, is all about bringing the final pieces of the puzzle together for the final confrontation in Act 3. Luke, Han, and Chewbacca devise a plan to go find the princess. They find where she is being held and loosely put handcuffs on Chewbacca to act like they are transferring a prisoner. When they get to the cell block, they are asked about the transfer, and they go to ask about it because they're unsure of it being real. So then a gunfight breaks out. Han, Luke, and Chewbacca shoot the guards and the cameras, so no one can see what happened. Luke goes to find the exact cell Leia is in, but another section of the Death Star sends reinforcements, as they are unsure, of course, of what happened, and Han is not giving a clear answer. Soon, the entire station is alerted to a prison break. Let's get to the second pinch point. The second pinch point is placed roughly at the 63% mark of your narrative, halfway through the midpoint and the end of Act 2. Just like the first pinch point, the second pinch point is used as an extra support structure. It is also another chance to raise the stakes and remind a protagonist of the antagonist and what's at stake. This also serves as a foreshadowing to the second plot point, sets up the major revelation that leads into Act 3, and more clues show up leading to that point. After their rescue goes sideways, Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewbacca have to find a way out of the prison block. Leia takes a blaster and shoots open a grate, and they all jump into a trash compactor. Unfortunately, the Imperials start to move the walls together to crush them before they can escape. Luckily, before that happens, R2 and 3PO are able to stop the walls and save them just moments before they're all crushed to death. Action period B, after the second pinch point. The second half of the action period covers the space between the second pinch point and the second plot point. The protagonist has a renewed push to complete their goal. After the second pinch point, the protagonist continues to push against the antagonist. The protagonist reaches what appears to be a victory, or false victory. Make sure that you don't change the characters too much up to this point, as the final and largest challenge and character development happens in Act 3. Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewbacca all try to make their way back to the hangar where the Falcon is. Han splits off to try and distract the Imperials while Luke and Leia make it back to the ship. During this point, Obi-Wan is finding and shutting down the controls to the tractor beam so they can escape. After a few more obstacles, Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewbacca make it back to the hangar to meet up with C-3PO and R2. And now we get to the second plot point, the end of Act 2. This is where everything under the sun unravels. After reaching their seeming victory, the protagonist is brought to their knees with a huge reversal and defeat. This is usually a very dark moment for the character. The lie reappears, forcing the protagonist to face their lie head on. This is when they make the fateful decision of either believing in the truth or falling back into the lie. Any covers remaining covering the conflict evaporate. There's nothing left. And the protagonist sees what the conflict is really about. It changes the narrative one last time and is usually another very big plot twist. This is, of course, the door between Acts 2 and Act 3. Of course, Luke, Leia, Han, Chewbacca, C-3PO, and R2 all make it back to the Millennium Falcon, and they are just waiting on Obi-Wan. This is their false victory. After this, Luke sees Obi-Wan and Darth Vader dueling. Obi-Wan is struck down, and they are forced to leave without him because, well, he's dead. They immediately get attacked by TIE fighters, which they destroy, and they jump into light speed away from the Death Star. The death of Obi-Wan is the dark moment for the protagonist. He no longer has his family, and he no longer has a mentor. Little do they know, however, that they are being tracked. Leia kind of figures it out. So now that we've gone through each section, we are of course going to go into some general tips when writing the second act. The plot has many ups and downs through it. It's not just one straight line from the beginning to the end, like a straight line graph. It goes up and down and up and down. It has hills and it has valleys. It doesn't have to be a static line, and the story is actually more fun if it's not a static line. It gets a lot more interesting that way. Give some time to all the characters involved. You can't just have it all focusing on the protagonist, and of course, as I've talked, that's all it kind of seems like I'm mentioning is the protagonist. But what a lot of stories do is give time to the other characters. Like, they show Obi-Wan shutting down the tractor beam. They show Han trying to distract the Imperials. They show the droids, R2 and C-3PO, trying to stop the trash compactor. There are a lot of moments that are focused on other characters and not the protagonist, so just make sure those moments are in there. Act 2 is not the time to resolve the conflict. Yes, there may be some smaller conflicts in there that you can fix and end in Act 2, but the main conflict is not going to be done and solved in the second act. That comes with the climax in Act 3. Make sure that those stakes and that goal are still there going into the final act. Don't lose sight of the goals and stakes. Since Act 2 is so open, a lot of people write and don't really remind themselves of the stakes and the goals that the protagonist needs to accomplish for the story. In fact, I constantly have a problem with that in my first draft. Luckily, the first draft is not needing to be anything special. Luckily, that is only the first draft, and as I go into other drafts, I slowly fix this problem, so then it's no more as I go further. But even as you write the first act, it's a good idea to keep it in the back of your mind, which is something I do have to work on, because not everyone is perfect, and working on your goals is a good way to spend your time. Finally, here is why I sectioned it up even more than what it was. It's mostly because I need more structure, and Act 2 is huge. It's so long, there's so many different parts of it. For me personally, my brain needed it to be more sectioned off. If it is too hard on you to do the traditional 3-act story structure without more sectioning, then try to section it a bit more, maybe like I did. Or you could come up with another way to section it off that is easier for you. Of course, you don't have to add more sections. The main part of the 3-act story structure is the first pinch point, the midpoint, the second pinch point, and the second plot point. Those are the major plot points in Act 2, but I sectioned it because it works for me. So do what really works for you. That is going to be the end of this video. I know that was a lot to take in. It took me a long time to get this figured out and how I was gonna make the video, but here we are. Do you do anything special when you write Act 2, or do you not write the acts at all? I hope you found this video enjoyable and somewhat helpful. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as I post videos like this every other week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next week. As always, never stop writing. Bye!